we'll go ahead and get started. So hello and welcome. My name is Taunya MacDonald. I'm the Director of Customer Success at LearnExperts. Okay, so as I mentioned, the first topic I really want to cover is the difference between orientation and onboarding. They're very different. So some organizations will call what they have onboarding when really it's orientation. So the difference mainly being orientation is very transactional. It's kind of those typical HR administrative things that we need to do in order to get someone up and running whenever they join the organization. So it's like signing paperwork, reading the health and safety policy, things of that nature. It's very transactional. So here are the papers, please sign them. Whereas onboarding is very relational. So although, orientation may be part of your onboarding because we need to do those processes to get you working in our organization, we also have very relational experience whenever it comes to onboarding. So that means you're making the relationships with the people and the tools that you need in order to perform your job. Orientation also tends to be a few hours or maybe a couple of days. It's a one-time event, whereas true onboarding is several months to up to a year where you're continuously learning throughout that journey. Orientation typically consists of one-way communications where it's perhaps the HR team letting the individual know this is the office, this is where you're going to sit, here are the papers you need to fill out. Whereas onboarding is really two-way communication. So typically there is that transactional stuff and some learning that they perhaps are doing on their own in a self-paced way, but we're also then creating the relationships that those individuals need in order to do their job well. Orientation typically consists of those need to know information. So where do you park if you're going on site, or if you're working from home, how will you get your hardware, things like that. Whereas onboarding tends to be role specific. It's typically customized depending on the department and what your role is going to be within the organization. So it will obviously contain those things that are the need to know information, but onboarding is much broader than that. So really, when you think of orientation, it's a small component of the overall onboarding, but onboarding itself is a much longer journey. Typical goals of successful onboarding programs, I've looked at these here. Usually what you're trying to do, and these may differ from organization to organization, you may have some slightly different goals for your onboarding program, but typically, because everyone wants to onboard their employees to become effective in their roles, usually the goals are the same. So the first one being to provide the tools, knowledge, and relationships to be successful in their role. Most organizations would like to create a program that's fun, innovative, engaging, and effective. One that acclimates the new hires to company life so that they transition into their roles smoothly and want to continue to work for your organization. From an HR perspective, it costs a lot to attract and hire new talent. So, if you have a lot of turnover from these new hires, that's going to cost the company a lot more money. So you really want them to have a smooth transition and want to stay with the organization. Typical goal is that it's a formal, consistent, and easy experience throughout the organization. So that consistency is really key. If you don't have a formal onboarding process for your organization, one department might be doing a great job on their own and have created their onboarding, while another department at the same organization could have a completely different experience. Perhaps they haven't built onboarding before, and so maybe it's not quite as effective. So you want to make sure that everyone is getting that great onboarding experience. Some of the benefits, and hopefully I feel like a little bit like I'm probably preaching to the choir here, because you've obviously joined because you feel that this is an important type of program, but just to sell you on it a little bit more. Typically, a great onboarding and program improves employees' engagement and productivity. So organizations with standard onboarding processes typically realize 50% greater new hire productivity. It also improves employee retention. So when new hires take part in a structured onboarding process, the statistics show that 66% of them are likely to remain with the company for longer than 3 years. So that's a pretty significant one, especially given when we consider the cost of attracting and hiring new talent. And outside of the new hires, your existing employees will also gain benefits from a great onboarding program. Manager satisfaction increases by approximately 20% when their employees have a formal onboarding training, since if they don't, typically those tasks of getting the new hire acclimated fall to their direct managers. So of course, they're really going to see this benefit because it's going to help them have effective, great reports who are, being a lot more productive, a lot more quickly without, so much one-on-one time from the managers themselves. So after I did quite a bit of research on various onboarding programs, I looked at a variety of companies. So if I was to put up the logos there would be a lot of familiar faces for you. And what I did was I created, this is in my nerding out, in my love of learning, created a spreadsheet that sort of looked at the common things that these programs had. So I kind of did a matrix to see the organizations and the components that they included in their programs. So what I've done here is I've picked out the most common things that those onboarding programs that are deemed to be really excellent, that they all kind of shared, so that you can see those features that really are the pieces that will give you that success. The first one being to start onboarding as soon as employment is confirmed. So as soon as you have a new hire that's signed that paper, try and find a way to engage them. You don't want to necessarily have them, suddenly taking on all of the actual learning, because obviously they're probably transitioning out of another role, but like fun things, perhaps a cute onboarding video. A lot of organizations send a little welcome gift, things of that nature that engage them right away. This is the critical one, and one I have always been in favor of, which is to provide structured, specific roadmaps or training paths, learning paths, however you call them in your organization. Having individuals know what to expect as far as their onboarding process really puts their mind at ease. Most people like to know what to expect. It really helps take away some of the anxiety that everyone is going to feel when starting in a new role. So if they can see exactly what to expect with really prescriptive onboarding paths, that really helps to calm their nerves. Provide the required hardware that they need to do their job as soon as you can. So, if you have an employee who is perhaps working from home, send them their hardware before day one. Make sure that they have some time to make sure they have everything before the first day. It's going to help them be more productive once you start on that hire date. If they will be coming into the office, make sure that they have a desk space and that the hardware that they need is there, and perhaps get IT to set up, the programs that they need. Include social and fun aspects. So this one is really critical. You want to build a culture that new hires want to be a part of. So if it was just really stagnant, boring onboarding training, with long lectures and really putting them to sleep, they're not going to feel that working for your organization is a lot of fun. Even for remote employees, there's lots of ways to engage in remote activities that make them feel included. So it's all about building those relationships whenever you incorporate those social and fun aspects, so that they want to continue to work there and have made relationships where if they get stuck, they have people that they can reach out to. Speaking of that, assigning mentors and buddies is another really great feature. One of the first onboarding programs that I designed, we implemented the mentor, we actually call it the buddy system. And this was perhaps 8 years ago. I don't know, it was some years ago anyway. And the person, one of the people who was my buddy during our first round of this, who I was mentoring, to this day, whenever I see him, he still calls me his buddy. So it was really effective. It really created a really great relationship, and we had a lot of good feedback about the program. So I can't speak highly enough of that one. I think that one ends up being a really fruitful feature. Avoid the mind-numbing lectures. No one wants to start off at a new job sitting and being droned to sleep by someone, just lecturing them on all of the ways that the company is great. So make sure that you have a variety of self-paced learning, mixing in with that fun stuff, as well as some instructor-led. Really mix it up so that they're engaged in the program. So that brings you into the combine that self-paced with instructor-led and practical hands-on training. You really want to try and have a variety. Look at the pieces of learning that are required and then choose appropriately whenever you're building your path. And the final one, which is also really critical, once you create an onboarding program, you've actually kind of created this living thing. And in order for it to keep living, you've got to feed it and take care of it. So you've really got to measure your effectiveness of your program and implement those ongoing updates. So once you've got it up and running, it's not a set it and forget it, unfortunately. You've got to be prepared to continually evaluate, is it still meeting our needs? You've got to ask, those people going through the training, if it's meeting their needs, what are you missing? And then continue to reiterate on that so that you make sure that you have a great program. Obviously, once you create it and launch it, it becomes a lot easier to maintain it. But if you just leave it be and never do any updates, it's going to become out of date very quickly and likely won't meet the needs of your organization. With that said, I want to share a little bit more about some of the research I've done. There's a few pieces that are kind of critical in terms of making a really great program. One of them that we've already kind of mentioned was that extending the learning window. So studies suggest when you extend that onboarding program for at least 6 months, you're really going to achieve effective learning saturation. Also keep in mind that beyond the speed to competency for the new hires, employees are still in the process of buying into your organization and your culture. So there's actually studies that show about 90% of employees are still deciding whether they want to stay at an organization or not throughout their first 6 months. As much as possible, try and incorporate that learning through others. So including personalized one-on-one approach to your extended onboarding will really improve learning retention. Since as people, this is really how we want to learn. And especially when you're starting in a new organization and you don't know anyone, creating those relationships and having people you can go to is a really critical difference, particularly in this age where we have a lot of dispersed employees who are perhaps working from home and might feel isolated and not really know who to reach out to. It's not like walking down the hall to Steve's desk and being able to ask him a question. So it becomes even more important to make those connections in this new day and age of working that we have. You want to guide the learning. So I've said this a few times, the learning path and having individuals know what's expected and when is a really critical part of creating a great onboarding path or program, excuse me. Just like classroom learning, it's important to provide a structure for any extended informal or hands-on learning. Creating those training paths for the entire length of your onboarding program ensures that learning is continuous, it's productive, and it's going to speed your new hires' time to productivity quite a bit. I've said this one as well, you want to measure, iterate, and scale. So that last one that I mentioned here, it also comes up in the research here by Stephen O'Brien. If you just create the program and launch it and leave it, you're not likely to achieve a lot of success. You want to make sure that once you've launched and built that program that you're measuring the impact, that you're making updates as necessary. You also got to make sure that it can scale. So as much as we want to incorporate all of those fun things, like, would it be great to have a highly individualized, gamified in-person learning for the entire extent of your onboarding program? Absolutely, that sounds great. Will that scale? It will not. So you want to make sure that you have the right mix of fun and information so that you can standardize and scale it so that you can grow with your organization. I actually find that there are, some organizations that sort of think, oh, this learning will just happen through osmosis. But really, you've got to make sure that it can scale as your organization grows. The other one that I really wanted to share when it comes to my research, this one has been out for a couple of years now, but it's one of my favorites and it's still applicable. And really, whenever this first came out, it kind of blew my mind, as well as a lot of people in the learning industry, because it really just clearly articulated what we all have kind of done over the years, but shifted our industry somewhat. So Josh Bersin, if you're from the learning industry, you may have heard of him. He created this learning in the flow of work. It really was the catalyst for the recent buzz around microlearning, which I'm sure you've probably heard of. It's sort of the latest trend. But the intention of this was not to replace traditional or longer training with just microlearning. It's to show how to use microlearning and macrolearning together in the most effective way. So early in a role, we need that macro learning to get started. So understanding the job, what's our domain, who are the people, what are the systems? And then as we progress up the learning curve, we need those continuous injections of new skills, information, and those connections to proceed until we become an expert. Then we tend to become the coach, and we teach others, moving in more of a horizontal way until we reach the next level of proficiency or role or promotion to energize our career. At that point, you might need another injection. So depending on where you're going in that curve, if you're going in the great trajectory and things are going well, you may just need some continuous micro learning in there to keep you motivated, feeling great about your job, and really feeling energized. In the normal one, if you perhaps aren't really looking for those opportunities to continue to learn, or it's not being given to you, you might just go on that normal track and be that employee who comes in and does a great job, but perhaps is not continuing to excel. However, if we do see that one of our hires or one of our direct reports is starting to go into a place where they're not as motivated and they're just not feeling as energized, that infusion of another macro learning may just do the trick. That intervention can help to go back up the curve and hopefully prevent someone to get bored or leave the organization because they've kind of gotten stuck in this rut. So I share this because I still use this today. I share it with so many organizations. One of the greatest things to come out more recently, and it really, if you try and follow this flow with incorporating macro learning at the right times, along with that micro learning as you need it, it's really going to make for an effective program. And this applies to all learning. This applies to onboarding as well as any other kind of learning program that you're creating. So to go along with that one, looking at those phases, starting with the macro learning and going into the micro learning as you progress through your role, when it comes to the learning progression, what happens is in those phases, so if we're looking here at where it's pre-boarding and orientation, those pieces of the learning, typically there's a lot of broad applicability. So usually the first few pieces of learning that you're making as part of the pre-boarding, the orientation, and perhaps even into the macro learning, it's going to apply to most roles in your organization. As you progress through the learning path, however, that's whenever it's going to increase in diversity and complexity. So for example, if I've hired someone and they're in marketing and I've hired someone else, they're starting at the same time and they're in sales, there's going to be some overlap of what they need in order to, join LearnExperts and learn our processes and who we are and our culture. But then as it gets into their role, into the sales role, into the marketing role, obviously what they need to learn and the processes that they use, they're going to be very different. So what you'll see typically in those learning paths is it starts off as an organizational path with perhaps a few optional elements depending on what level, are you management, are you in the executive layer? And then as you progress through that learning path, typically then it starts to diverge into specific departments. And then even within those departments, it goes into specific roles. So although you might have one general path that applies to the organization, you're going to have a lot of different onboarding paths if you create that real onboarding program, depending on the role of your new hires. So I now want to switch into gear, and instead of talking about the research and all of that stuff, which is really great, it's important to understand the why behind what we're doing. Now I want to tell you how to do it. So I use this process basically every time I create an onboarding learning path with any organization. The one piece that I haven't put in here is I often will do a training assessment with organizations I work with. It's quite a strategic sort of look into the organization, which involves quite a few interviews, but the creation of the learning path itself is what I'm going to focus on here. So the first step in the process I usually take is to determine the roles that require training and their main business outcomes to be achieved with the training. So for onboarding, the roles are everybody. That's easy. And then the business outcome is obviously we want them to, get up and proficient in their role as quickly as possible. So onboarding tends to be one that's a little bit more generic and standard, but obviously we want to also look at those individuals, perhaps by department, perhaps by role, and really think about the outcome for those specific roles as well as the kind of generic side of things, which we'll look at. From there, I look at each of the roles. So we take the roles one by one based on their priorities and determine the high-level tasks or knowledge each of the roles require in order to perform their job. From there, the roles and tasks are entered into a matrix to look for areas of overlap. So this is particularly true for onboarding. When you're creating any training path, whether it be customer, partner, internal, typically there's going to be pieces of that learning that apply to everyone, but then there's going to be pieces of learning that certain roles need that others don't. So it's important to look for those areas of overlap, because when you then start to build your program, you want to focus on where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck. So where you have that overlap, that's going to give you the broadest audience. That's really where you want to focus your attention to start, so that you can start to roll out your learning as you finish perhaps chunks of it, depending on what your plan is for your rollout. From there, we then start to create the learning paths themselves. So once we start mapping it out and looking at the tasks, it's now the role to, there's a bit of finesse to this as well. I have a hard time describing how I do this to people sometimes. Some of it is just experience and knowing kind of what tasks go well together. Subject matter experts are often very helpful in this, in helping determine what goes together in a logical way. But really, this part is really involved in this. It's determining the appropriate grouping of those tasks for creating actual full courses and any testing required. So you might want to provide badges or some kind of gates along the way so that your learners really feel that they are making progress in their learning. So I'm going to look at each of these in a little more detail. The first one being determine those roles and business outcomes. So I'm going to talk about typically how I do it, and then I'm going to give us an example in the onboarding space. So you want to identify those roles that require training. In onboarding, it's pretty easy. Typically, you need to onboard everyone who's a new hire. Then you want to look at what are the main business outcomes to achieve. And this applies to all training. This is how I always create training paths. So for that role, what is the main thing they need to achieve at the end of that training? What are they looking to achieve? Then you want to take all of those roles with their business outcomes and prioritize them in order to determine how you want to work through the roles. Usually you want to start with the roles that have sort of the broadest applicability, that are going to have the training that has the most overlap. So for our example, if we're thinking of onboarding, the roles are going to be all new hires. So usually, and again, you want to try and group your new hires. You don't want to start off with a list of every single role that your organization has. What you want to try and do is group them in a way that's logical for that sort of high level training. So typically on onboarding, most organizations go with individual contributors, people managers, and then executives. Individual contributors is usually the highest priority role, because usually those are the ones you're hiring the most of. Typically, the learning that they require is going to apply to everyone. So usually the individual contributor training also applies to people managers and executives. And lastly, your individual contributors are usually the ones who are going to have a really, big impact in your organization. So getting them up and efficient is going to be really important. Not that people managers and executives are not, they most certainly are, but the frequency for hiring in those roles is a lot less. And then obviously people managers and executives, they're going to have, certain tasks, perhaps certain systems that they're going to need outside of what individual contributors need. So their paths are going to veer slightly. So each of those groups would probably have its own learning path. And then even within those groups, there can be subgroups depending on department or things of that nature. And then the way that I look at that main business outcome, this is how I kind of pry it out of my subject matter experts or an organization that I'm working with. And I ask them, what is the number one thing we want individual contributors to be able to achieve after onboarding? The nice thing about this is in onboarding, the answer is pretty obvious. We want them to understand the company they are now working for, how to be successful in their new role, and particularly we want them to make connections with the people and the systems that they need in order to be proficient in that role. Then what we want to do is we want to take those roles and determine those lower level tasks. So that was the main business outcome. Now, in order to achieve that, we need to break that up into smaller pieces. So for this one, you're looking at the high level tasks and or knowledge that each of those roles require. So if we're looking at individual contributors, and again, I'm keeping these examples very generic for the purposes of staying within a 1-hour webinar. We want them to recognize the culture of the company that they're working for, know who or where to go for information they need to do their job, identify what's expected of them in their new role, learn the processes and tools to perform their job well. Now, beyond those pieces, obviously there's probably more tasks that I would determine with an organization. There's going to be some, signing of HR papers, understanding health and safety. There's going to be a lot more tasks in there. And even within those 4 tasks that we just listed, typically beneath them, you continue to break those pieces into smaller pieces. Really, all you're doing when you're creating those learning paths is taking the big chunks of learning or the big pieces or big knowledge that you need and continuing to break it down into smaller and smaller pieces until it's something that you can teach and that it's, that you can really create training for. In that vein of things, I mentioned this, there are usually a few elements in every onboarding program. So I've made, as I mentioned a few times now, I've made quite a few of these programs. Typically, most of them have the elements that I'm seeing here. So these would be pieces of learning. So typically, regardless of the role and the knowledge or tasks that are needed, most onboarding programs have these common components that anyone starting a new job, regardless of their position, are going to need. So an introduction to the company. You want them to understand who you are, what you do, what's your purpose, your vision, your mission. Usually there's some kind of message from the CEO. If the CEO is delivering it himself in person or herself in person, even better. That's wonderful. I love to hear that we have CEOs that are doing that because it makes them very approachable. Typically, there is going to be a piece on where to find who and what they need. So usually this is I've actually had an organization that implemented this in a really fun way. They actually created a scavenger hunt of questions that needed to be answered. And the answers had to come from other individuals in the organization. So really these people, and I forget, there was a way that they kind of determined who to ask what to. And it changed all the time, but it was really fun and employees loved it. It was, as the feedback came in for the program, it was one of the favorite things of most of the employees because it was a game. They got to talk to people. It was really well done. Company policies, that's an obvious one. I've mentioned it a few times. HR obviously has policies and forms that need to be filled out. So that is going to happen at any organization. And typically an introduction into your product or solution. So what is it that you do for your customers? What are you providing? What's your product? What does it do? Why are you different? Another really important piece. And usually these pieces that I'm showing here are pretty soon in the onboarding journey. So usually these are pieces that are important to establish near the beginning of your journey. So I also mentioned once I had those tasks, so once I kind of broke down those tasks, I actually enter them into this matrix. And I then do some mapping. So usually I'll have the roles here. So it would say the role where it says role 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Perhaps you'd have a description of the role. Just again, if you're typically, I'm doing this and working with a group of subject matter experts. Perhaps it's HR, some other organization. Then the outcome of that role. So that's that number one thing that they need to achieve in order to be successful in their role, or what you want them to achieve at the end of the training. And then I break up the tasks. So when we get into breaking up those lower level tasks, I put them all in this matrix. And then this actually has come out of Excel, because it can be quite a large document depending on how large the organization is and the kind of roles they have. And then I enter all of the tasks into the matrix and I color code it. And what that shows me is the common pieces. It also makes me be able to start to visually pick out, okay, so most people have this one. Let's make that into a course. They all kind of go together. I start to group together the tasks into courses whenever they're related. And I start to see the training path forming before my eyes by looking at it in sort of a visual way. Once I've got that all filled out, then I get into the business of actually creating the learning paths. So for onboarding, it's pretty easy to start off by making sort of a generic path to start with, and then branching that generic path out to different roles. So I've showed sort of a version of one that I've done in the past. Most of the onboarding programs that I've created look something like this, but you'll see the main components that are really critical, especially for the learners to understand what that journey is that they understand the what, so what kind of training they're taking, and the when. So we didn't get so prescriptive to say on day 1 at 2:30 you must do this. It's just on day 1 we want you to do these 3 pieces of learning. Some of them might be self-paced, some of them perhaps are face-to-face or one-on-one, maybe they're meeting their buddy. So whatever we want them to do on day 1. And then you'll notice that I only have a few elements there. On day 1 is very overwhelming for new hires. You really want to try and keep day 1 to the absolute necessary things that they need to do or paperwork they need to sign, because they're going to be getting acclimated, finding their desk, getting their system set up. You want to make sure that you're not overwhelming them on day 1. In week 1, again, there will be elements that they need to achieve, and then in week 2, and then in month 1. Then at the very end of the path, and you'll notice that some of these are filled out and some of them they aren't. Obviously, each organization and what they need is going to be different, and so I just put in some of these blank spaces to show what a full path typically looks like. But usually what we have after that is then into the role specific. So, for example, if we had the 3 roles that we had discussed in the example, after this generic path, you would then expect to see an onboarding path for individual contributors, an onboarding continuing path for people managers, and then one for the executives. So from here, it doesn't mean that the journey is done. Remember, we said extending that window is a big part of creating a really great onboarding program. What's really important is that you have this initial generic path that applies to most people, but then that there is another follow-on path. And it probably looks similar to what I'm showing here, but it's going to be on an individual, it's going to be on a group basis, but it's going to be a smaller group at that point. The last component that I didn't address yet is what you see in the gray. So if you have a complex product or solution, you also want to try and sprinkle the training throughout. for your product or solution, and if there's certification involved with that. I can tell you, as an instructor, I've done a lot of programs where we have tried to feed our participants through the fire hose. So I'm coming on site for 2 weeks of product training, and when I leave, you're supposed to know everything from A to Z. It's just not effective. People don't learn like that. It's too much information in too short of a time. So it's really important that we incorporate with the macro learning those pieces of micro learning throughout, and so that we break up those big chunks of learning into those smaller pieces so that people can actually retain it, and that we're giving them the information that they need when they need it, so that it's relevant and so that they can actually remember it. The other piece that isn't really called out anywhere here, but there is also, you want to consider places for badges or perhaps knowledge checks throughout, to include not just to test to see if they know it, but those knowledge checks also help as review and repetition. So a lot of people think, oh, those knowledge checks are all about getting the grade at the end, because that's what we kind of did in school as children. But really the critical piece of that is to keep them engaged and to have that repetition. So I have stuck right to my hour-long time frame. I'm really glad. I was a little worried when I started reading through this a few times this week that it might be going over, but luckily it fit right in. So a little bit of a look at what we learned today. So onboarding is more than orientation. We looked at the 8 features of successful onboarding programs, how to incorporate learning progression in your programs, how to plan and structure your onboarding program, and then how to develop those learning paths for continued growth. If I could add on to this, if I had more time with you, I also would have had a bullet in there on what metrics to be looking at to continually evaluate your program. That one is another really key one. We didn't have enough time today, but happy to reach out and talk to anyone who's on the call today, because I don't know if it comes through, but I love this stuff. I'm a little bit geeking out whenever it comes to creating learning paths. It's my favorite thing to do in my job. So anyone has questions, please, reach out via the chat, or even after, if you want to connect on LinkedIn. I'm more than happy to talk about this stuff anytime. Anu, you did say that we had a couple questions come in. We do have a few more minutes. I was wondering if you want to share with me any of the questions that may have come in while I was chatting away.
For sure. So there was a couple of questions on how to manage virtual onboarding versus in-person onboarding.
Perfect. That's a really great question, really timely. So it's a great question, because I actually happen to work in an organization that's entirely remote. We do have some shared workspace that we use, but for most of the time we are dispersed. And so we have an onboarding program that suits that need. You can actually achieve a lot of the fun stuff in a remote way. And actually, if I think about it, the organizations that I've worked at in the last 12 years have had remote employees. So for me, this is not just new since the pandemic. I've been living this for a lot of my career. And really what you want to make sure to do is just to incorporate that time to meet the people. So the suggestion that I made of the organization that did a virtual scavenger hunt. So, they didn't actually have to go and walk to someone's desk to do that scavenger hunt. That was actually a remote game that they had created, and the people had to reach out via, I think they were using Teams. It was like via Teams, and find some of these people. Also doing things like virtual meet and greets, virtual happy hour. And when you're doing those things, not just have it be that boring lecture stuff, but find some online games. I'm trying to think, there's been a game that we played internally a few times. Oh, and the name of it is escaping me. But if you look online, there are some safe from work games that really encourage collaboration and working as a team. Highly recommend incorporating those into your onboarding as well, because it's really fun. Most of the other pieces of it, anything you can really do as far as training, you can achieve virtually. So if you have instructor-led, instead of doing instructor-led, do virtual instructor-led. Make sure you're sharing your cameras, make sure people are seeing each other's faces, make sure there's opportunity for the participants to speak to whoever the instructor is, as well as the other participants. But you can achieve most of these things whenever you're doing virtual. I would recommend, we have a blog, actually. If you go to our website, we have a blog about making really great, effective virtual learning experiences. I would check that out because it has a lot of tips and tricks on that. And actually, I think I did a webinar about that at the very beginning of the pandemic that might also be on the website, but perhaps it's not. Anyway, reach out. I have lots of ideas in that space. Any other
Awesome.
questions?
Yeah, so there is one final question here, and the person is asking, so how do you differentiate onboarding when you have two sources who handle onboarding? So in this person's organization, the HR team does the orientation like onboarding, and then they have an enablement team that runs the role-based onboarding. And they're trying to create what she's calling two swim lanes, and she's not sure how to do that.
Yeah, so in those cases, I've worked in this as well. I've come across this. The important piece of that is for although you have these sort of two swim lanes that are happening in your organization, for the new hire, it should look seamlessly as one training path. So you can't create those two swim lanes in a vacuum. You have to collaborate. So when you're doing that initial needs assessment, when you're looking at who are the roles, what do they need, you've got to work together to come up with the full path. You can't make an enablement path and an HR path. You have to look at it together, because for the individual, they're doing that onboarding as an individual. They're the one going through everything. And they're the ones that you have to think about the learning experience for. So really put yourself in the shoes of the learner. What are they going to want to see? They're going to want to see their full training path, regardless if it's coming from HR or it's coming from enablement. So although there may be two departments handling different pieces of that, you want to make sure that the program itself is inclusive of both of them. So really you need to get together, break down those silos, work together to get the overall program in place, and then decide who owns which pieces of that learning. So actually one of the very first onboarding programs that I created was exactly like that. It was like to a T what you're describing. HR owned part of it, and then I was in enablement, and I owned the other piece of it. And we worked together to come up with the initial program and path. And then we just had really defined lines in the sand where I own this, you own that, and just make sure that everything is very clear. So really doing your work ahead of time and making that structured program, that's what's going to help you win in the end, so that there's not, sort of tension between those two teams that are working together.
That's it for the questions for today.
Great. Well, I think that wraps things up. We're right at 2 o'clock here. I know people have places to go. I really want to just say thank you so much to everyone who joined today. I hope you learned something. As I mentioned, please feel free to reach out to me, myself on LinkedIn, or to our organization via the website. I have our email up there right now. And let us know if you have questions, want to learn more about our product or our services, or just have questions on onboarding. Please just reach out. I am more than happy to help. This is my passion, and I just love talking about it. So don't hesitate if you have those nagging questions that are still lingering in your mind. Thank you so much, everyone. I hope everyone has a really great day.